My name is Mirjana Askovic, and I'm director of the Australian Neurofeedback Institute. Stories Worth Telling are a series of interviews with clinicians, scientists, and researchers who change the way we understand mental health and how we work with our patients. These interviews are the opportunity to share their stories and experiences that shape them as professionals and as human beings. Our guest today is Sebern Fisher, who was a teacher and mentor to many of us who embark on a journey to integrate neurofeedback and psychotherapy in working with survivors of trauma. Sebern is a clinician, and she has a private practice in Northampton, Massachusetts. She has been working with traumatized people for over 35 years, and she has integrated neurofeedback into her practice 23 years ago. Sebern is an internationally recognized expert on the use of neurofeedback in trauma and best-selling author of the book Neurofeedback in the Treatment of Developmental Trauma, Calming the Fear-Driven Brain. Sebern consults and trains on the integration of neurofeedback and psychotherapy nationally and internationally. She has written and presented several amazing webinars and covered the impact of trauma on the brain and integration of neurofeedback with psychotherapy. Sebern, welcome to our program.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I look forward to this.
Sebern, in our conversation earlier, you told me that you have 3 missions in your life: to bring neurofeedback into the field of psychotherapy, to bring psychotherapy and understanding of mind into neurofeedback, and to destigmatize trauma.
Right.
Could you tell us a little bit more about it? Why this mission?
There you go. There's the mission. I've been thinking a lot about this conversation and about sort of background conversations that you and I have had about the fact and the nature of developmental trauma. Talking really about developmental trauma here for purposes of this conversation. And when I was 4, my parents left me in the care of our housekeeper and her husband, and when they came back, they didn't recognize that some pretty terrible things had happened to me in their absence. And I'm not going to go into any detail. There's no good reason to do that, but just to know that I think that what that left me in, without having any words for this until really quite recently, it left me in the trauma field, in the field of intense abandonment and dissociation, background, at least dissociation, learning difficulties, ambient fear, and neurological difficulties that persisted into my adult life. So one of the things that I'm interested in, one of the main things that I'm interested in our work together, meaning all of us in the field, you and me, of course, is that we figure out, or we discuss together, what the true nature of trauma is, and then how we can best approach it, since it is either in its most terrible form, developmental trauma, or in its less but almost equally terrible form of PTSD, to figure out how we can best address this as psychotherapists, as well as neurofeedback clinicians. And as I've come to believe that I wouldn't have made the changes that I made without neurofeedback. In fact, I felt them almost immediately. And we can get to that story if you wish, but what happened when I was 4 set me up for a lifetime, and mostly of experiencing trauma, then of, if such a word is adequate, recovering from this with many modalities. But the one that I think is the most significant is neurofeedback. So, well, it's neurofeedback along with therapy and body work and hyperbaric oxygen and, you know, a number of other things that I did to recover from these events and events that seem to follow on it as a result of it. The trauma field is an attractor for other trauma. And so it kept piling on. And it's a whole, I could do a whole parallel story with this story of my biography that would be a trauma biography. And somehow these are always interweaving, right? You know, I'm experiencing everything that I experienced at the same time as I'm going to school and going to college and get, you know, all the stuff that, you know, we could be talking about, right? Talk about all that stuff. So anyway, that's how it gets started, and I have no say over that. And all too often early on, no say over who it led me to be. You know, I was hospitalized and I was drugged and I was shocked and I had all of the awful things that happen to psychiatric patients, particularly those of us who are pretty out of control. So, so that's a part of it, and it leads us to a conversation about. Well, I'll tell people how this is going to end, because I think this will all get to. Is that so? This happened in a house out in a suburb outside of New York, and which I left when I was age 10. This happened when I was 4, and I visited this house again in October, and visited the new owners. And I will end with the story of what happened there, because it really goes a long way in the hypothesis of are we reaching in or trying to diminish or change up or disrupt the trauma field, and what's the nature of that in terms of frequency in our brains and bodies.
Sebern, thank you for bringing your personal story into this conversation. I remember you told me that you don't remember time without trauma. And that stayed with me, and it's still here with me, because that's the story of many of our patients. Can you tell us what that really means for those who didn't live with trauma their whole life? What that really means to live your whole life with trauma?
Well, it's I think that I see this in everybody, is that it's very difficult for people to, really, even in this narrative, it gets set up immediately as, you know, the trauma narrative. I didn't know any of this at the time, but my whole identity was wrapped around these early experiences of terror and no safety. And you just live in some ongoing, you just manage that somehow. You just live your life. You go to kindergarten. You know, I have no idea how I went to kindergarten after these events, but I did. Right? I don't know who I would have been without these events, and all of the events that toppled on me as a result of these, or that I created as a result of this early experience. And there were just a lot of them. But I also managed to, you know, I was also leading a life. It was almost in a sense a double life, because this was always going on with more or less awareness from me. And, you know, I was, you know, I have some stories to tell you that are not about trauma, that I was just, you know, like everybody else, lived my life. But I had this identity that was inevitably formed, and a personality, shame, anger, fear, that dominated me in ways that might not be true if you wouldn't be true, I don't think, unless you'd had this kind of double whammy of both having these, this abuse experience and then having no one know. And those people continued to live in the same house as I did, which many people go through this. But it was, and it is a terrible thing. Nothing gets quite real for you. Nothing is certified. We talked about this, right? There's no, who says, yes, this happened? Nobody, right? Until you sort your way or make your way, or somehow someone helps you, and this is why the therapy part is so important. Somebody helps you understand the narrative of these kinds of histories, and your own personal version of that narrative.
So from what you told me last time when we spoke is one is when trauma happens, but the other is also not recognition, that when your caregivers, parents, people around you don't recognize that it happened, then you live in that unknown how and why you are. Why is your life unfolding the way it is?
Mariana, you can't even ask the question in a lot of ways, right? Because it doesn't even frame up as a question. You're asked to forget it, and when you're 4, you do, right? There's nothing to, all memory is interpersonal. So if you're in it with somebody else, and if you're not in your life, and particularly in these kind of events, if you're not in them, you can't be, because that's what, if dissociation is a psychological defense, this is what it was built for. I, as you know, don't think it's a psychological defense, but that's another webinar. I never knew what was real. I never knew what was motivating me, but I never knew to ask the questions. Is this real? What's motivating me? Those were questions that had to come in therapy. I had to be corralled, which I was, and asked to look at these kinds of questions. And there was nobody else asking them. So, and when I was first hospitalized, it was a long time ago, when I was first hospitalized, most psychiatric disorders were seen as Oedipal complexes. Can you imagine arriving at a place, my therapist was not so smitten with Oedipal theory, which was good, but it was everywhere. And so everything was an Oedipal conflict. And, not the case at all. And that then your reality would get rendered somehow in this paradigm of some imagination of Sigmund Freud's, you're sunk again, in as much as anybody that you as your care person buys into that, or equally, I think, can buy into CBT or into anything, right? That isn't about you and what happened to you, specifically what happened to you. So,
So that's just then to cement that something is wrong with you.
Yeah.
There is something about you that's a problem, not what happened to you.
Right. Not to mention what happened to your brain. Because even when they ask you what happened to you, it's still a mind conversation. Something's wrong. Something's been done to your mind, and that's the most standard diagnosis that I would be given is schizophrenia. And we could say, well, that's because that was a long time ago and they didn't recognize trauma. But I would say the vast majority of people who are getting the diagnosis of schizophrenia still are going to be traumatized people where it's not recognized, or bipolar or whatever.
And that's what we see as well, that many of young people who had first episode of psychosis actually had quite severe trauma in their background. And we are just beginning to recognize that and understand. But in time when you were seeking help, none of that was available.
No.
And from what I was left with when we spoke about that is that actually that was additional torture. That those who were there to give that support and understanding actually were there who confirmed that you are the problem. Mm-hmm. And left you with not many tools there.
Well, and not only that, but the problem is that I was the problem. It wasn't like, traumatized people are all that easy to work with or be with or hang out with. It's like everything is so off the rails. Everything is so difficult to manage. Behaviorally, I couldn't think clearly. I was on medications that made me sick. There wasn't a thing about it that it was easy. And to learn at, I think I was 52 when I did my first neurofeedback session. And I was completely skeptical about this, that this would do anything, because I too was wedded to psychological theory. More sophisticated, but still, I knew Marsha Lenehan. Marsha Lenehan and I were in the same, and I would like to talk a little bit about the facts, the actual things that happened, and that not all in the hospital, but Marsha Lenehan and I met each other on the psych ward in the most disturbed ward of the Institute of Living. And this is known, I'm not spilling anything here. She has made this clear in both her biography and in an interview with the New York Times. She was in a seclusion room when I got moved up to this place. And she became one of the main people to question the whole diagnostic framework. And because she became just interested in behaviors and not so much in the psyche that produced them. And I became interested in the psyche that produced them. And we both got into our camps. And she and I would have these debates on the phone. She was in Seattle and I was in Massachusetts. So she always had a time advantage, and she had data and more data and more data. It was very difficult for us to talk about things like attachment and trauma as a source point of dialectical behavior therapy, although it's in there, right, as a source of the problem of, quote, borderline personality disorder, which she hated. She hated that term and wanted it to be called affect regulation disorder. Interesting, right? That never saw the light of day, but that's, of course, what we're talking about all the time. We would have no trouble agreeing to that at all. So she was 19, I was 20, and and that's where we met, and we maintained a relationship and a really wonderful friendship until now. So. But DBT suffers from the same problem of not recognizing the problem is in the brain. And she doesn't want to believe it's in the psyche either. So it's like, okay, all right, it's in the behaviors. Right? Feelings are, in her mind, behaviors. So we have had many robust conversations about this, and trying to get her introduced. And she got very interested in neurofeedback. But the problem is that even when you're as powerful and influential as Marsha was, it is, she has to keep getting grant money. And there was no grant money that was going to support neurofeedback. Mm. So, and there was grant money that was going to continue to support some other aspect of DBT. So we never got off the ground. although in many forays into working together on grants and stuff.
One question that many of survivors of developmental trauma are asking, why me? And you had some interesting idea around what it really means to have a repetition of trauma again and again and again, and how to explain why bad things happen, not just once, but they kept happening.
Yeah, well, she also taught, Marsha would also talk about how, it's funny how she could be with us, but she would talk about how borderline patients had bad luck. So she recognized the phenomenon. And I presume she would talk about it with her patients as bad luck. But my patients never felt that it was bad luck. They always felt that there was something inherently wrong with them. And in a way, that was true. And in the way that it is true, I don't want to be quoted out of context here because people are so shaming themselves already or feeling so ashamed already. It's really an empowerment to understand that the trauma field is so powerful, and it sets up in the way that I'm thinking about it now, and what you and I can explore is the way that it sets up is in the frequency domain of the brain, and it propagates there in patterns and pattern recognition. And somewhere in that formation of a trauma field that is in the outside of us, but also very powerfully inside the brain, all of it coded in the frequency domain of function, which is it. I mean, we're all frequencies all the time. We just either, it feels like this desk is hard, but it's got frequencies going on too. But where we can really reach these frequencies is in the brain. The brain will engage in that language with us. And so when we're training, we can change. We really do have an interchange that can change the nature of the frequency domain and the nature of the field. And so, but before that happens, we are walking around, traumatized people are walking around as attractors for more trauma. So I told you the story, I think, of walking to meet a friend of mine in Riverside Park. I lived in New York, and I walked down a path that turned out she had walked down just a few minutes before me to meet at the place in the park. And I asked her when I got there, somewhat shook, if Flasher had assaulted her as well. She said, no, nothing like that had happened. As this is minutes, this guy jumped out at me. So if you don't have a paradigm other than it's bad, it's secret, it isn't even that you necessarily think that way, right? But it's all terror all the time. You are moving through, and then these events happen, or I'm the one who's held up at knife point in my apartment building. So, right, or I go out on a hot air balloon ride, and this is much later. Hot air balloons never crash. This hot air balloon crashed, and and I was the only one injured in the crash. So I broke my leg. After a while, and I could give you hundreds, literally hundreds of examples of this. You can't, if you don't have a very sophisticated understanding of what's going on, you could really start to think something was terribly wrong with you, and that you attracted these creeps into your life, and you got yourself in dangerous situations. And of course, what we're also finding with Lanius's latest work is that the default mode network, the sense of self network in the brain, only forms up in conditions of risk. So there has to be a threat for this person to feel they have a sense of self at all. So that's another compounding factor, right? Of a life that gets stamped when you're a little kid and you have and it's just done, and you're in it and that's what you live out. And I think without neurofeedback, people live it out, even though they understand it, even though they've been cared for, even though they get the best therapy, they live this element out for the rest of their lives.
And that's what we see as therapists, is that often you just go from one crisis to another crisis. And it creating safety, it looks like things are getting better, and then something happens. Often something externally happens, and after a while really starts to look like, why is this happening to me? Clients are asking, my patients are asking me as well, why is this happening? Or telling me things will happen again. Something bad is going to happen. And it does. And all of that story around, now you're safe here, you're safe now, just goes down the drain. And you're left with no scientific explanation. Why is this happening again?
Because you're not really safe. As long as you're attracting this stuff, you're not safe. And safety isn't even in the frame. It's not, the trauma field and the safety don't exist. They don't coexist. The trauma field swamps safety every time. And as I'm saying, as I'm thinking more about it, as I described, it forms up in these pattern blooms in the brain, and who knows? I was walking down that path to Riverside Park. Am I always anticipating something? Probably. Do I draw that to me as a result? Maybe. Is that person also a traumatized person? Probably. Is that why we have a field match, a pattern match on the path going down to the Riverside Park? Probably. And my friend didn't have that history. There was no pattern match. There was no implicit contract, come get me, right? I'm yours for the taking, which is what abandoned children wear on their backs. Come, take me, I'm yours. There's no one to protect me. And that was pretty much I had privileges of class and race and protections that are afforded by a privilege. Had I suffered this as well as all of the kind of environmental horror that people can go through, I'm not sure that I would have made it either. I don't think I would have made it to neurofeedback. You have to be privileged to get to neurofeedback, right? It's like, so yeah.
There is parallel story to this story. Part of your story that you told me was about your trauma, but part of the story also was a story of your survival and amazing gifts that you had. I was one of the stories that really, I really liked this story when you were on a set for Godfather, and your role in helping to get this movie that we all remember and we all watched. Can you tell us that story?
Yeah, I'll say. I'm glad we switched out because I don't have much more to say about that anyway. So the one of the problems that I had as a result, I think, of all this was that I had a pretty severe spatial learning disability, and we're also not diagnosed, so I just thought I was stupid, right? One of the things that I went to a typing class all summer long, and I could never learn to type. I could not organize myself. I mean, it seems straightforward, right? We could take that on an assessment, but there was no language for it. So I was in New York. I needed to find a job, and I couldn't find a job because I couldn't type, because that's all you either needed to teach, be a nurse, or be a typist. That was it. Those were your three options, or get married, and the presumption was then you would then need to work, or shouldn't work. I don't know, but that wasn't what I was going to do. So anyway, I needed to find a job, and I saw an ad for the Quick Trip Messenger Service, which is a car service where you would deliver messages for different companies. And they hired me, and they said they were quite they loved the idea that I was a girl, right? Because I was the only girl. And they also told me that they were a bonded messenger service, and did I know what that meant? And I said that I thought that meant they had money in the bank if I took anything. And they said, that's what it usually means. But here what it means is that I'm a former NYPD, New York City policeman. And if you steal anything, I'm going to take you out to the middle of Central Park, and you won't. Okay. So there was no subtlety at all. And it was interesting that, but then they liked me as well, mostly because I was a girl. And so they got the account for a movie being made in New York that summer, and that spring and summer, and that was The Godfather. So they would give me as many of the Godfather calls, and so I met Marlon Brando and Al Pacino and a lot of people, the actors and actresses on that film, because I would deliver call sheets to them to say where to show up the next day for the shoot. And I have a lot of stories about this, and I don't go into all of them, but one of them that give an idea, a little bit of why I survived, I think. So I had a little Volkswagen Squareback that I was, and I'd get $4 for every completed message, right? In New York, heavy traffic, cabs, horns, anything. So we were down in Greenwich Village, and I was like 2 miles to the center of town through all this traffic. And the producer of the associate producer was there, and he was pacing the floor of the store. It was now had a set front on it. And he said, I don't know what to do. We are days and days behind schedule, and we don't have a permit for the snowmaking machine. And so they sent me to the lawyer. I went to the lawyer, Midtown Park. It's just crazy. This is $4, right? So, and I go up into this nearly abandoned building, or nearly not filled up building yet, where Paramount Studios legal team was. The guy was in Sicily. He couldn't sign any papers. I go back down to the village, park, find a way to get into the set, back to the guy. And he said, oh God, I don't know what I'm going to do. We're really, this is right. I said, well, I'll sign it. And he said, oh, you will? I said, sure, I'll sign it. So he said, he hardly thought. He said, fine. I signed it and went off and delivered the paper to the authorities, the bureaucrats and now another mile and a half, at least, in city traffic park. The next day, I'm up on the set and to do a delivery or to pick up something. And he saw me and he said, oh, what name did you use? And I said, oh, I don't know. I just scrawled. No one would ever be able to know what name that was. So, that was the, I don't know. That was the life force that it came through me, and a sort of rebellion that I think is still somewhat of a hallmark of who I am. So I worked on The Godfather. I was also, during that time, I co-produced a women's consciousness raising show on the radio station in New York called WBAI, which is a Pacifica station in sort of a left wing, not sort of, very left wing station that at first refused to put women, and this was a women's consciousness raising hour. And they at first refused to put it on because they said they already had women's programming, which was 1/2 hour of one woman talking about some issue in the news that affected women out of, endless shows they had. So I put in a call. I don't know that I have the guts to do this now. But anyway, I called the Federal Communications Commission and asked for Newton Minow, who was really the left-wing member of the Federal Communications Commission, which oversees the licensure of all stations. And I told him the story. My uncle was a political guy and fairly well connected. He was also a left-wing person, and he knew Newton Minow. So I used my maiden name, which was his name as well. And then I said, that's not really my name. And he said, oh, so who are you? He said, wonderful. And anyway, he said, I'm glad you called me. It is, I get a lot of complaints about WBAI, right? Because they would talk about things that people don't want to talk about. And I'm glad I don't have to add this one to the official count. Go back and talk to them in 3 days. I went back and talked to them in 3 days. Guess what? We had a women's consciousness raising show on it. And what we did was we would pre-record. There were 6 of us. We would pre-record on a topic, like rape or abortion or whatever the topic was. And then we would edit that, which was physically cutting tape and splicing it together. That's like very labor intensive. And the show, and then we would have a pause after the conversation. It was a 2-hour show. We'd try to find some piece of women's music to play, to break it up. And then we would only take calls from women about whatever the topic was. And this became one of the shows was published in, I think it was called Notes from the Third Year, which was a feminist magazine. And it was one of the highest revenue shows. I mean, more people gave money because of that show than they did it for most of the other shows. So,
That's just amazing.
Yeah, it was great. It was great. So, yeah, that was in 1969. Before that, I was in the hospital most of 1962 to 1967. For that 5 years, I was more in the hospital than out. When I got out, I went to or returned to Columbia University, where I was going to film school and also to what's called the School of General Studies. And so now we're in the spring of 1968. One of my courses is on Vietnam with a guy named David Schoenbrunn, who was terrific. And one of the people that came to talk to the class in the law school was Thich Nhat Hanh. That day, I had just come back from a vacation, and I had my first ever migraine headache. So I couldn't go. And John went. And I still, someplace in this space, have the notes that he wrote from Thich Nhat Hanh talking about the experience of Vietnam, but even more about Buddhism and about the anti-war movement had to become the peace movement, or nothing would change. And I would see him, I would see this monk walk around Columbia. And, you know, I didn't know what to make of it, but, you know, he became a very important figure to me later on. And I'm not even sure that I remembered exactly who he was when he came back into my life. And then it was the student takeover of the buildings at Columbia in a protest against the war and a protest against the way Columbia was treating the neighborhood, because they were trying to buy up buildings and particularly get rid of people who were on rent subsidies. So there was a lot of, and they were building a gymnasium in Harlem and restricting access to it. There was going to be a white entrance and a black entrance, a neighborhood entrance and a student entrance, but it was essentially white and black. So there was a lot to be angry with Columbia about. And so as a member more of the neighborhood, but also as a student, I was now 20, almost 25, I was older than that. I joined SDS, which was the radical student organization, Students for a Democratic Society. I was sort of a wallflower. I kind of didn't know these people. I didn't know if I liked these people. I didn't know about liking people or not liking people anyway, because they didn't frame up for me in a certain way. But I was one of the 8 or 9 people that took over the president's office at Columbia, which was, you know, it was one of these things is once you're in there, and there you are, you've got the president's office, and then you say, now what do we do? You know? And for me, I mean, for me, it was that I had an adopted son who I needed to go home. John's son, I married John, he already had a child, and Johnny was with us. I had to go back and take care of Johnny. But that became the whole big, you know, student or riots. The only one who really rioted were the police. And I was arrested in the second, what was called the second bust, the second big arrest of students. And tried. Well, eventually was not tried, but I was taken to jail and taken into court and so on. So, yeah. And so that was really my life in New York. And I was we were both, and almost everybody that I knew and paid were organizing on a just about daily basis to stop the war in Vietnam. And that was the, you know, that was the imperative of the age. And I think we did. It took a long time, but I think we did. I mean, I think the whole student movement changed everything. But then there were dynamics in the buildings of so much sexism between the boys toward the girls and the revolutionary men toward the women. And this led to a kind of feminist consciousness in me and in many of the women there, who realized that they were being treated badly, even though they were also occupying buildings and so on. They were treated badly by the male elite. And one of the things, so feminism organized in New York around Columbia and around, you know, many other experiences people brought together. But the first women's center opened in New York. First one that I know about was in New York. And then, and it was also identified by a group of us that there was a huge house on Riverside Drive. This is prime real estate in New York that was empty, that was owned by Columbia. And I can't remember how we found all this, but we did. And we wanted to start a daycare center. So guess what? That's what we did. We started the first publicly operated daycare center in New York City. at this house, which we called the Children's Mansion. And it was all, kids from the neighborhood, not wealthy kids by and large. I became the accountant. I had learning disability. I screwed up the books, but we nonetheless pulled off starting the first childcare, publicly funded childcare, because New York took over the cost of this. Publicly funded daycare center in the city of New York.
That's another story, Sebern.
Yeah, right. Well, there are a lot of them.
Why did you leave New York?
Shortly after that, my daughter had, we had a baby girl in 1970, and she had a lot of pneumonias. She was really allergic, as it turned out, to New York. And through the help of my grandmother, we were able to buy a little house up in Western Massachusetts, which is where I am right now, in that house, somewhat not so little anymore, but an expanded version of that house. And here too, I came here because we both decided there was action here. This is an academic area. There was an active women's movement that had already started, and I got involved very quickly in the Women's Film Co-op, and then through that, I met some women who were starting the first family planning service in Massachusetts. They had some money from Planned Parenthood to start this, and so I joined ranks with them, and we started there the first. I opened the first family planning clinic in the state of Massachusetts, and was a counselor there, and went on in that organization to become the director of training. And really, it was that everybody in a psych hospital says they're going to be psychotherapists. So I decided I would not become a psychotherapist, right? Because everyone's going to do that. So, but now I'm in counseling position with people in crisis. There's no availability of abortion. There's, all kinds of different crises around sex, sexuality, and birth control. And I'm meeting them once, and I'm meeting them at this moment of crisis and trying to, help them through that. Since it was the first clinic and it was up here in the rural area of Western Massachusetts, there were no other clinics. We would open one night a week, which is all we had funds for, but it was free, and it was a first come, first served kind of deal. And so we would start at 7 on a Thursday night and probably end at midnight, because there would be at least 40 or 45 people who couldn't get services anywhere. So anyway, I'm counseling people and learning how to do this. And I said, this is not the right time for me to be helping people. I need to be helping before this kind of crisis arises in their life, or at least to know more about them, to be able to help them in any reasonable way. And it was then that I decided to go and get I finished my bachelor's at UMass. So I went to Smith, I went to at Columbia, and then I finally got my degree at UMass. Every time you matriculate, you lose credit. So I thought if I changed schools often enough, I'd be back to high school, because I kept losing credits. But I finally graduated from UMass, and then 2 years later, and I was very much an adult student. I was doing all this without a college degree, because I was in the hospital during college time. So that's when people go to college. And so I got my degree at Antioch, which had a program that I could manage while working and raising children. So I went there and I got my degree in my MA in 78.
there is really interesting story how you became a director of the service for adolescents. Can you tell us that story? Because I think it's really fascinating.
Well, yeah, this is another improbable story. I worked in, as I said, I was working in family planning. One of the things that was happening is at the same moment in time was that a neighbor child of ours was in a lot of trouble, was put into the Department of Social Services, took her out of her home. And we knew this child because she was a close friend of my son's, and her younger sisters were friends with my daughter, and they were in the neighborhood. And so there was a lot of effort to get her reunited with her. She was molested by her grandmother's boyfriend, and her mother didn't want to believe it. She was hot. The girl who became my foster daughter they kept trying to place her and get her back into her home, and they had a caseworker who worked with her in our house and worked with their family in hers and theirs. The Department of Social Services tried to place her a number of places, and she would run away, or she would do something that would get her thrown out of hospitals, whatever. So, and the only place they could figure that she would stay was with us. So she ended up with us. We got to know the caseworker as a result of this. And so then I leave family planning and decided I want to write a book. I take some time off. Go back to, I've finished my degree, and I see an ad for a clinical director of a residential treatment facility. And I applied for it, and I was in the running with one other person. And that other person was the caseworker for my foster daughter. Was considerably older than I was, and had her own trauma history. She had been on a kinder transport to save her from Nazi Germany. They're a wonderful woman. They're a PhD. I had an MA, and we were the two candidates, and they chose her. And which is completely understandable to me. But when they told her, she knew that I was the other candidate, she said to them, any program that would not hire Sebern to be in this position is not a program. I don't want to work for that program. So I got the job by default and was at it for 17 years. And it was during that time where I learned, I learned a great deal about psychotherapy. I learned a great deal about trauma, somebody else's, right, along with my own, and dealt with some very deep, serious dissociative disorders in the best way that I could, and brought attachment therapy, or understanding of attachment rupture into that setting, brought DBT into that setting through Marsha. I was at Marsha's first DBT course, which was in North Carolina, and it's a fabulous group of people. And we all learned DBT from her. This is before her book, just about the same time her book was coming out. And then the center where I was the clinical director became the first residential milieu treatment center that used DBT. And we would train the kids in DBT, and we trained the staff in DBT. Unfortunately, the kids got much better at the lingo. They were more interested in it, or it was more, they had to learn it. And they would use all of these behavioral understandings against the staff who, didn't have, they didn't.
Right.
So, it had its limits, but it was a trainable model. And we hadn't been able to find a model that would work, because if you used a reparenting model, which was really what was going on, then people really felt like the only path for them as staff members was to use parenting techniques that had been used with them. And most of them had not been well parented, right? The vast majority of them had been hit or abused or humiliated or whatever. That would get replicated. So it was just an effort to change that up and to have a trainable model. So that's where I was when I was working with 2 DID patients and a couple of other kids who had severe trauma but didn't have dissociative disorders. Those were my caseload. I was the clinical director as well. And it's then when a friend of mine asked me if I wanted to try this weird thing that she was learning about called neurofeedback.
So you had the neurofeedback marathon, 2 days of neurofeedback. How did that work for you?
Well, I've said to you before, I'm not to other people that I don't do this at home. We don't do 2 days straight of neurofeedback. We didn't know any better. And I'm not sure that it was all in all a bad idea. I'm not endorsing it. I'm just saying that I don't know if I had such a dramatic effect, and that may have had such a dramatic effect because it was so much at one time. But what happened over that weekend was that I trained Friday night, Saturday, Sunday morning, and then I went with a friend of mine, Kathy Zilberman, who was wonderful. And it was a Focus 1000, which is not even made anymore, which is essentially the feedback. We're always so fussy about the games, right? The feedback for me was a red light, a yellow light, and a green light, right? Yellow, you were on your way, either to getting nothing or to getting green. So, that was the entire, that beep, where it's a feedback. And I had this profound experience that I saw colors differently. I saw the world vividly in a way that I had never seen it before. It's like gray scales fell from my eyes, and I saw the true color of things. And I realized, although I got hypomanic, and I had a migraine as a result because we were training at a frequency that still do that to me, I think, at 12 to 15 hertz. But something deeply changed in me that I finally recognized was that I had a greatly reduced sense of experience of fear. And I lived with it every day, so I didn't even know that I was living with it and that it was impacting me the way that it was. And a startle response that I had always lived was really a hyper startle response went away. I mean, I did a list earlier today, anticipating our talk, and I have about 20 symptoms, really big deal symptoms that I was dealing with, not realizing they were connected necessarily to anything that had gone on for me, although that was starting to get clear to me because of the therapy I was in. But I had chronic back pain and migraine and seizure disorder and head injury and very intense emotions and repetitive thoughts, intrusive thoughts, impulsivity. I mean, it goes on and on and on. All of these things that would really get in my way. Also, I mean, it's the kind of thing like saying you're going to sign a document for Paramount. So it's really not the best prefrontal cortex decision making, right? It's like it's entirely impulsive, but it just turned out to be very useful at that moment, and very useful to them. And I'm assuming that they never found out. No one ever looks at these papers, I figure, anyway. So, but I was impulsive. Yeah, I think I may have lost that thread, but it was just, everything changed as a result of training my brain, and I just got the first glimpse of it. But the fact that the startle response had me jump out of my chair or fight not to do that went away was just extraordinary. And I knew that I was in a different, I wrote somewhere that all of our brains have a mind of their own, and that I had tapped into that, not thinking at all about frequency. I didn't know how this worked. I didn't believe any of this. I just did this because Kathy needed somebody who she knew was interested in internal states to help her keep track of her experiment. I had no idea. I didn't believe any of this. I didn't think any of this was going to work. It's why I'm here today, right? It's like, in all kinds of ways, it's why I'm here today.
So you started that journey in 1996, 97. So it's
96. You're right. That's 96.
That's really more than two decades in being in this field. Did something change from the time when you first started with neurofeedback until today, in your understanding of what neurofeedback is and how to use neurofeedback when you work with clients with trauma?
Well, since I started with net zero understanding of what I was doing, I trained with the Othmers, and the very first thing that organized for me was that the most important thing that neurofeedback was doing was not about attention per se, but it was about affect regulation. And affect regulation, well, I had been at a conference during the first years of neurofeedback. I was at a conference where Bessel van der Kolk and Alan Shore and some others were presenting. And in Bessel's talk, it was 600 people in a huge hall for Harvard, continuing ed at Harvard. And Bessel got up there and said, if there's anybody here who knows how to regulate affect, you have the keys to the kingdom. Now, I was not impulsive enough to jump up and say, I know. But eventually I found a way to meet Bessel. And this was also at a conference in 2008. And there's a whole story that we could go there. But I met him in an attachment conference. And I was one of the workshop people, and he was the keynote speaker. And a friend of mine was then the head of the organization, and she made sure we had as private a lunch as you can have with Bessel van der Kolk. And that's when I met him. We actually became friends very quickly in the course of the next few months. But and he got it. He really understood what I was talking about. He really got it, and that was a huge relief. But in terms of I think we're still learning what we're doing. I'm only beginning recently to emphasize with people that already know about neurofeedback that this is frequency medicine, that what we are addressing is this vast and powerful field that propagates in the human brain and in all human brains, and you bring that together and you have a very powerful trauma field within and without. And when you meet up with that field as a traumatized person with the external trauma field all hell breaks loose. There's no way to regulate this, and there's no way to repair it, in my mind, to address it, because none of those words work very well, but to have this frequency conversation and to help the brain learn not to propagate these scenarios, and not to attract them. And that's, and I was mostly training myself with talking to Sue once a week, and she tried to take me through it, because I had all of this, I had head injury and history of concussion, unconsciousness, mind, just everything that happened. So there was a lot of brain to work through. There was a lot of stuff.
You wrote very early on, when you started to use neurofeedback, you wrote a paper with Totner's brain, something around brain becoming a mind.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Can you just tell us a little bit about that? Because that was something that you didn't know.
Yeah, I don't remember the title of it, but it was, I said at the end of it, that neurofeedback people, and neurofeedback clinicians who were using neurofeedback were in the privileged position of being with someone as brain became mind, because they're not separable. And when you quiet this repetitive firing of different circuits, multiple circuits and interconnected circuits and all the complications, you just quiet that arousal down. Typically, I mean, there are other things obviously you can do, but you quiet the arousal down, the interior world shifts, and the mind of the person is different, and the personality. I was no longer terrified. I was no longer. I mean, this happened in stages. Right? I don't want to make anything too simple here, but I was no longer at fits of rage or I just everything. I literally became a different person. And in the same process, in the same period of time, I was doing intensive therapy with this fabulous therapist who was helping me put words to really define what had happened to me. And so that was going on at the same moment of time. And one of the revelatory moments in neurofeedback was at C4. So everyone thinks this is the vanilla position. Think again. At C4, I had I was doing 12 to 15 hertz, and I was doing this on Focus 1000, and I had a full-blown flashback, but it revealed one of the signature events of what happened in this house outside of New York, and that opened up a whole territory for me, and it was really keeping pace with the opening up of the system and the regulation of the system. It was so it was so much and continue to work and live a life and write a paper here and now and again.
So what is the role of psychotherapists? Because you said that's your second goal, to bring psychotherapy into neurofeedback. So what is the role of psychotherapists?
Well, I think it's the role that psychotherapists already have, which is to be present, to really be present. I wrote about this in the book, that my therapist described himself as the devoted other. Now, when I went into therapy and then before neurofeedback, what I recognize now, what I understand now because of Ruth Lanius's work, is that I did not have the default mode network. It would be a whole nother interview to talk about what it was like to walk through the world without a sense of self or other. right? It's not, I mean, you do it, you do it because that's what living requires. But it has its complications and challenges, let's put it that way. And so one of the things that I recognized in Mariana is that I think there was a sequence to this. I don't think that as I couldn't have found my therapist, which was the template then, as I think therapy is the template for the relationship that's missing or that needs repair. I wouldn't have found him without neurofeedback. He could not produce in my brain a default mode network. How much he would wished he could have, he couldn't have done it. But the sequence that I'm thinking is true, and I'd be very interested in other people's experience of this who are willing to talk to me about it, is that first came online him. I got an idea of his true existence separate from me, and then I came online. And it's not such a clear order as that, but I think there is a sequence to it. I think that's probably replicates what happens with babies and mothers, is that the baby first recognizes their mother, and as the baby grows and develops and in the care of the mother and the father, they can differentiate themselves, or there's, I'm sure, a very complex process. But I was just interested to discover that, there may be an order to this, that you see the other first and then you gain your sense of self.
There is no us without others.
Right. No baby without a mother.
No.
And yet almost everyone that we are working with has felt abandoned by their mothers. And I certainly was. It wasn't intentional. It was just obliviousness. But it was kind of hard to be oblivious to this, but they were. So maybe it would be time now to talk about what happened when I went back, right? Okay. So as I started telling you at the beginning of this interview, some of you know for sure that I'm writing a memoir, and the memoir is essentially a neurofeedback memoir. It's going to be talking about the process of healing trauma, and so I'm very much in me, and what I found is useful for other people too. So in service of the memoir, what I wanted to do was to go back and see the house where this all happened. I hadn't been there since I was 10 years old, so that was this had happened 75 years ago. I was there. I'm not 85, but I was 4 when this happened. So 75 years ago when this happened. So I wrote to the homeowners at the address. That's all. I didn't know who they were, and I got a response back, and they were. It was an attorney. I don't want to use his name on the internet. He was a guy who had well, anyway, in his email to me, he said, my wife and I are very happy to have you come and see the house, and you can look at anything that you need to look at. And so I thought very wise to look up whose house this was. And now I had his name and their names, and I looked it up, and he had graduated from law school in 1991, and he had become a district attorney in the Bronx, in one of the boroughs of New York, and he was prosecuting child crimes of child abuse. So the owner of the house that this happened. So we went down there in this fall, and they were incredibly wonderful people, very gracious. And there was didn't talk to them. I had said I was writing a memoir, which I am. And, but there was no mention of anything specific. Although, if he's prosecuting these crimes, he's probably got an idea. But I wasn't going to introduce this into his house, So, they greeted us, and John was with me, and we went and we looked around the house, and they showed us around the house. And I saw a second floor, I saw where my bedroom was. And then all of this happened on the third floor. So when we got to that part, I said to them, I think that I'd better, probably it's best if I do this on my own. And John came with me, but they said, fine, we'll meet you downstairs whenever you're ready. Take as much time, look in any place you want to go. You can go in any room. So I went up, and I was now in the kind of common area, large hallway where, or open space, not really large hallway. Went up the stairs and standing there, and in the room where it happened, that was his office.
What a chance for something like this to happen.
I know, this is where we get back to feels. But I could feel in the space, in the common area, I could feel that this was cleansed, that this was clean, that I could not evoke or provoke or invoke or bring on in any way. It did not feel that it was there. It was gone. It was over. It was done. And partly, I think that had to do with the energy of these two people. The room that was over my bedroom that would cause me so much terror. So I would hear their footsteps, overhead. And it would, if my parents weren't in the house, this would be terrifying to me. And they left me in their care because they didn't know, right? So that room was their son's room. And there was a large poster of a basketball player, a famous basketball player in the US, a guy named Stephen Curry. So Stephen Curry this had meaning, a number of reasons, but one of the reasons is that Stephen Curry is an elite athlete that uses neurofeedback. So all of the fields sort of coalesced there. And there just isn't better language to talk about it with, for me anyway, and to feel how much this house was cleansed of it, but how much I was cleansed of it. And how, if that was ever going to happen, that I could reorganize this field and plummet into it again, it was going to be there. And none of that occurred. And we talked with them for a while. And when we were talking with, I just don't want to use his name. He's so wonderful. I feel like I don't want to avoid his name, but I really have to. But he was talking about being a prosecutor. So he's in this very difficult position of prosecuting child abuse, crimes of child abuse. And he was often prosecuting a family member of the child that he was defending, right? He was taking care of. And it was an impossible position. He talked to me a little bit about how he would, the advice that therapists gave him about not attaching to these kids. And it was just impossible. So at one point, he just put his hand on his heart and he said, I know this is selfish, but it was easier for me, a lot easier, to prosecute child murder than it was to prosecute child abuse. And at that point, I then had in this house where there was no mirroring of anything that ever happened to me, was this sudden mirroring of how serious it was, what had gone. Did that give you chill? Gives me chill.
You told me, and I really, really think about that a lot, that there is no healing for trauma, that there is better word would be clearing from trauma than healing from trauma.
Yeah. Of this order, you know, it so takes over an individual. And it's not psychological. It's just not psychological. So, so what language are we left with? I think the language of field propagation, the pattern replication in the brain, and how powerful it's like, we have the common experience of somebody looking at us across the room, right? How do we feel that? How do we feel that? Someone's looking at us from behind, or how do we feel that? That's not just traumatized people. People feel that. Or they, so it's a phenomenon of energy. And once we adopt and understand what Einstein said, that everything is energy, well, then everything is energy. If everything is energy, then everything is frequencies. So everything is frequencies. How do we reach that? And the trauma field itself is made up of frequencies. So it is, I don't think there is another way to get to how the brain has to align itself to survive these events than to use neurofeedback in conjunction with a very good trauma therapy. And I did body work as well, as I mentioned in the beginning, and some other things along the way, all of which helped me. But the change agent, without question, was neurofeedback.
Story that you just said is so touching. It shows that trauma is not just me, my little me, is us. That there is no clearing also without clearing the field. But that is then affecting a life of people around us. Our personal journey and our personal clearing, healing has ripple effect, as does trauma, and is affecting much more people around us than we think. Story that you said about going back to the house and also experiencing justice. Person that was there is someone who is there to recognize what happened, to persecute those who were perpetrators. That's how to explain that.
Right. I know. I feel the same way. I told this story to Ed Hamlin, who's a colleague of mine over here. So we're close friends. And he sort of rocked back. It was on Zoom, and he said, rocked back, and he said, there is no way to explain that but a field effect. And I mentioned that to John, and he said, and they probably thought they just liked the house. They bought the house. It's like that. But it's so improbable that something like that would happen. And their kindness and generosity, openness to me, right from the get-go, their warmth and we never ever spoke about what happened to me. They didn't ask me, and I didn't want to leave them with that. There's no reason to confirm what they probably knew, so why I was there and why I wanted to be alone on the third floor. I mean, they've got to, they know this stuff. So yeah, it was extraordinary. It was an extraordinary confirmation of a way that I don't think it could have been. I don't know. It was cleared. It was cleaned. It was over. And otherwise, it would have propagated. It would have propagated in me, and it probably would have propagated in them because it was there. It was in that house. It wasn't there. It just was not there.
Mm.
So, it's funny. I guess what I'm stumbling with is that it's funny because it's not like I needed confirmation. It was over. Overness is one of the newness and overness and getting rid of stuckness and all these elegant words that we were stumbling over at the training. Trying to get this brain to do something different and new changes. When that happens, it changes the entire field. And inside of me. And I have to also say, and I mentioned earlier, that I had ideal conditions. I had a very supportive marriage and kids that were doing okay most of the time. I had when I was on this part of the very long road, I had supportive conditions. So, I don't know that this will happen for everybody, but I think ultimately where it led me was into a spiritual domain. It's not me, and it's let's see if I have my response in here. Yeah, good. Okay. So, and this is not a patient of mine. This is somebody who's worked with somebody else and done neurofeedback with somebody else. She's had particularly profound responses to Indian Ridge. And this is what she's writing. So I'm ready to tell you about a new experience I'm having. It seems like it's a strong testament to the potential of neurofeedback. I've talked about the disorientation I experienced when fear calmed. How do I proceed in the world without fear, complicated by the lingering pandemic? Recently, I've experienced a distinct but unexpected absence of reactivity, which seems different from the absence of fear, around decades-old series of traumatic events. I'm going to skip over that, so this is identifying information. My closest friend, she confronted her father around incest, this person who's writing me, and her closest friend had done the same thing. Recently, she and I spoke on the phone for 7 hours about incest, family dynamics, etc. So I'm writing you because I realized after a 7-hour conversation of a steady flow of painful memories of abuse, neglect, lawsuits, public betrayal, the reactive physiological response I've always had during these conversations was gone. Automatically, capital letters G-O-N-E, gone. For the first time, my physiology was quiet. I wasn't reacting to the conversation with adrenaline. My brain didn't overwhelm and it didn't collapse during the conversation or after. This seems nothing short of a miracle. Similar to the absence of fear, the absence of reactivity is disorienting. What do my past traumatic experiences mean in the absence of reactivity? If sensations don't overwhelm me and I can, quote, think about things, then what will these experiences mean? Who was I? Who am I now? I don't have any experience thinking about these things without overwhelming body sensations that shut down thinking. There's nothing to pivot to. Disoriented is only part of it. Without overwhelming sensations, my mind feels like an empty white space. It almost echoes in there. I feel like an adult without a history. I'm quote, lost in the light or invisible in the light. What do I do so I don't lose my mind again? There's the trauma reference creeping back into, because what other one do you have for this? As my mind processes this without reactivity, as I work through this with my therapist. There is also an emergence of a pureness about this state, a serenity about it, and an emergence of new life. It's not frightening. I'm lost in my mind, but I have never felt more present in my body or in the room. My friend and I talked about how much we loved therapy in the 90s, how we benefited from therapists teaching us about family dynamics, incest family dynamics, what happened to us. Somatics is an important piece in trauma treatment, but it isn't enough. Sometimes treatment stops with regulation of sensation. Some of us still want talk therapy, understanding and clarity about our histories without fear and reactivity. This is a whole new chapter here. Neurofeedback takes away our defenses from the trauma. Regulation isn't enough. Psychotherapy matters a lot too. If you're still reading, thank you for everything. I'm one of the lucky ones, getting out of darkness and moving toward peace. So as you can imagine, I mean, this is profound, right? A profound distance. So let me just read what I wrote back to her. Thank you for sharing that. I used her name, but I'm not using it here. Thank you for sharing this deep, profound reflection. I think I know what you're experiencing. What is this mind? What meaning is to be made of all that historical horror if one no longer reacts to it? It is a new ground of being. You are stepping out of a powerful field. Where are you then? What organizes you, capital Y? This, for me, is where the Buddhists come in. This is the terrifying and often grieved loss of the ego. It's not, however much it might feel this way, loss of your mind. That's the former and inevitable paradigm of trauma. This is a beautifully written description of the new field in which I practice on retreat and in every morning's meditation. Welcome here.
Sebern, this is the most profound letter that I've ever heard about, and your reply as well. It gives us all hope. You know, we are stepping out of trauma field, but then its pull is so strong because that's where our identity is, so that it's easy to get sucked back into it. And practices such as meditation, mindfulness, together with neurofeedback can help us to. I'm not there yet, but I see that you are, and I remember you, my friend, 20 years ago. And how profound this journey is, how strong pull is to go back to trauma is as well, to keep who you are, who you think you are, because that's the only you that you know.
That's the reality of, yeah.
But at the same time, when you step, your toe, even if just one toe out, you feel another pull.
Yeah.
And there is peace. There is that wholeness that's different me and different us on the other side. And I really hope that many of us will join you there. So
I do too. I do too.
Thank you, Sebern, for this interview.
Thank you, Mariana, for this conversation. It's really so deep to be talking this way. And when we, when there's time for a talk with a bigger community for conversation, I look forward to that too. We can talk about anything, but what I'm interested in most for me is people's reflections on the trauma field and the frequency domain of trauma and how we're reaching it. So, thank you.
Thank you, Sebern. Goodbye, everyone, and we hope to meet you at Q&A. We will set a date and inform everyone about Time with Sebern, where you can reflect on today's conversation and add your piece of your thoughts, your understanding of trauma field, frequency domain, neurofeedback. So you're welcome to join us. Goodbye.